taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages. So, as you may know, we've been involved in this topic for many years. And early in the work on this, we thought a lot about what kind of strategic research might be done. Thanks very much. So we had done some preliminary work on sugar-sweetened beverages going back more than 25 years, but not many people were paying attention to the issue. But then in 2009, the issue popped back into the picture. And it popped back into the picture for a number of political and scientific reasons. Boy, I'm not going to be dehydrated, am I? Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Several things happened. One was that people started paying more attention to the issue scientifically, but also the economy wasn't so good in the United States at that point, and people were looking for sources of revenue, and such a tax might provide one such source. So in 2009, I wrote an op-ed piece with Tom Frieden, who you may know at the time was the health commissioner in New York City, then became the director of the Centers for Disease Control, making a public policy case for taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages. And the case is pretty apparent. People are consuming lots of these beverages. Science shows that they're linked to risks for obesity, diabetes, and other problems, so consumption ought to decrease, and that would be a public health victory. Then we followed with a second piece on the topic, and several of the co-authors on this, Barry Popkin and David Ludwig, are here, making both a public health and economic case for taxing sugar-sweetened beverages. The reason we wanted to make an economic case for this is that economists, for the most part, don't like to interfere with the free market, and companies selling soda to people is part of the free market. But economists are a little more likely to be inclined to interfere with this process or to create policies that might change this process if certain conditions are met. And so in this paper, we talked about externalities of sugar-sweetened beverage intake, namely that lots of people are affected other than those just involved in the transaction, the company and the buyers, because of healthcare costs to the countries in general, and people through programs like Medicare and Medicaid having to pay. And we also looked at information asymmetries, that is, the companies having a lot more information on the consequences of sugar-sweetened beverage intake than consumers. But at the same time, there were lots of things happening out there in the policy world, and people in legislative positions were beginning to consider sugar-sweetened beverages. So at that time, we did some studies that we hoped would contribute to the discussion and be very helpful to policymakers. The first was work we did on the elasticity of sugared beverage consumption. Tanya Andreeva, an economist working with us, did some modeling on this and tried to project what the changes in beverage consumption would be with taxes at certain levels. Very much akin to what the work had occurred many years ago on tobacco, where people had tried to project changes in tobacco intake based on changes in prices. So we worked that out and then followed with another paper that looked at the revenue part of this. How much money could jurisdictions raise by using taxes? Because remember, a lot of the people who were thinking about taxes were interested in how much money it would generate and what that could be used for, not just the health consequences of declining sugared beverage consumption. But these are scientific papers and may not get out to the intended audiences. So what we did was created an interactive calculator that still exists on the Rudd Center website where you can go in and put in any major city or state in the United States and put in a tax level and then create an estimate of the revenue that would be generated. So it creates a grid like this, and using Massachusetts as an example, the most important number is the one on the bottom right. So if one put in a tax in Massachusetts of 1 penny per ounce on any beverage with added sugar, it would raise $276 million a year. And then you could do it for Boston or other jurisdictions and find out how much revenue can be raised. And this is very helpful for the politicians, because then they have a sense of the money coming in and what it might happen to be used for. So the soda taxes have now been passed in a number of places around the U.S. I crossed out Chicago-Cook County because they repealed the tax, and some of you are probably aware that the state of California passed a preemption law that I'll come back to in a little bit that may preempt ultimately the cities from doing their own taxes. And then, thanks to work by Barry Popkin and others, taxes have now been passed in a great number of places around the world. So outside the U.S., countries are way ahead of us with respect to this. But it was interesting. There was an interesting case study in Philadelphia about this. I was speaking with the former health commissioner of Philadelphia, Don Schwartz, who said he was speaking with Mayor Nutter, who was the mayor before the current one, and they were ruling the fact that the city didn't have much money. They were interested in doing something about obesity, childhood obesity in particular, and Commissioner Schwartz said he brought the mayor over to the computer and pulled up the tax calculator and found out the amount of money that Philadelphia could raise through a sugared beverage tax, and that got the mayor very interested in this. And then Mayor Nutter came quite close to passing a tax, but was unsuccessful. And then Mayor Kenney came along in Philadelphia, and now Philadelphia has quite a large tax, in fact, a good bit larger than the 1 penny per ounce that I mentioned as the default. So that was an example of that tax calculator being helpful. And so to the extent that our strategic research had any impact on policy in this, it was probably through these pathways, a different set of pathways than occurred from the other problems, but these are the way we think the mechanisms of change are occurring. Then case study number 4, has to do with misleading labeling. Some of you may be aware that back in 2009, the food industry launched a program called Smart Choices. And Smart Choices was a program where the industry more or less got together with itself and came up with a series of nutrient criteria for its products. And then any product that met the industry-defined standards for good nutrition could be awarded the Smart Choices label. And the industries were quite interesting in the way they approached their particular products. So for example, the cereal people would have tough criteria for salt, but lax criteria for sugar. And the opposite might be the case for the fast food industry. So these were very self-serving. And then they were self-serving enough that products like these could be awarded the Smart Choices label. Now, when I was in Connecticut, our Attorney General at the time, Richard Blumenthal, who's now a U.S. Senator, had been very actively involved in fights against the tobacco industry. And he was really a consumer protection attorney general. He did a great number of things to protect the health and welfare of the citizens of Connecticut. I wrote him a letter one day and said, "You've done such great work on these other topics. Would you be interested in taking on nutrition-related issues?" This is before Smart Choices. And I wasn't expecting a response. I just thought I would send it to see what happened. Well, not only did I get a response, I got a call from his office that said he'd like to come and meet with you. And so he and I met, and he said, "I'd love to take on these issues, but we have to find the right issue to take on and figure out where there might be some legal leverage to take action." And so we left it at that. We would wait for the right issue to come along. And then when Smart Choices happened, I thought, well, maybe this is such an issue. So I got in touch with him, and he said, "Let me put my staff attorneys on it to look into it." He did, and then several days later, they called back, and he said, "Let's go get them." And it was an exciting thing for a scientist to think about doing that, because I had no idea about the legality of these things or what sort of leverage a state attorney general might have, but it was exciting to think about what kind of possibilities might exist. So when Attorney General Blumenthal then took action against the companies. He did several things. One was he issued demand letters to the companies, all the companies involved in this, which is just short of a subpoena, asking that they provide all their records on how the criteria were getting used and who paid who to come up with the criteria. Now, an interesting player in this became a professional society familiar to many of us in the room, the American Society of Nutrition. So that particular society, which is highly respected, publishes great things like the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, had taken a large grant from the food industry to administer this program. So the public appearance of this would have been that the food industry didn't come up with the criteria, that this professional society had come up with the criteria, and that they were considered the main driver of this. So it was kind of not a money laundering thing, but it was a very interesting sleight of hand to affect public perception of how this came about. So Attorney General Blumenthal knew about this, and he issued demand letters to the officers of that society. So industry is used to receiving such letters from an attorney general, but officers of the society are not. They're like me and you, and they're not used to hearing from an attorney general. And all of a sudden, this started to look like a big reputation risk to the society and to the companies. So the companies could have taken a long time and just stalled this. They could have fought it in court. They could have filed motions. They could have done a lot of things to prevent taking action, probably long enough that the program would have run its course and they would have been on to something else. But several things happened that made it not possible for them to do this. One is that the New York Times found out about the Smart Choices program and wrote a very critical article about it. And the second, the New York Times then found out about the Connecticut Attorney General investigation into this, and then wrote about this, and these things were syndicated all over the country. And word got out that there were a number of other attorneys general in other states that were quite interested in taking action behind the Connecticut Attorney General. And so in 2009, a number of things happened relatively quickly. One was that on September 4th, the New York Times wrote a critical article about smart choices. The Connecticut Attorney General launched the investigation on October 14th. October 20th, the head of the FDA held an open call that was quite critical of smart choices. And on October 23rd, scarcely 6 weeks after smart choices had been launched, the industry closed it down. Now, the work that we had done that was strategically relevant here was all that work on marketing of breakfast cereals to kids. And so the Connecticut Attorney General held a press conference, and he held up a box of, I think, Fruit Loops and said, why should the citizens of Connecticut be told by the industry that this is a smart choice? And why are the companies marketing this most aggressively to our children? And so he basically won the public relations war. And so the industry, which has spent a lot of money investing in this program and labeling boxes and things, closed the program down in a relatively short period of time. So to me, that was a very, very important victory. I mean, who knows what impact on consumers smart choices would have had? Somebody would have had to document that. It could have been a lot or a little. But it was really the first time that a state AG had paid attention to these issues in the way that the Connecticut Attorney General did. And that had big impact on the companies. Now, we could have published 100 studies on this program and its impact, and it would not have had any dent at all in the industry behavior until a change agent got a hold of it and the information became relevant to them. So in this case, we weren't the change agent. The Attorney General was the change agent, but we provided information that we hope was helpful in his work. So this is an example of activation through these particular pathways. Now, again, the change agent is different from the other case studies I provided. The pathway of change is different. But the concept here